Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. Many college students may still qualify for an economic impact payment. Review the guidelines and register by November 21st at IRS.gov. IR 2020-250, November 5th, 2020, Washington. The Internal Revenue Service IRS today urged any eligible self-supporting college student who doesn't need to file a tax return to register by November 21st so they can receive an economic impact payment before the end of the year. So there's been some confusion with the college students because note that if you're a dependent, then you can't typically get an economic impact payment because you would be claimed as a dependent by somebody else, in this case possibly the parent. The parent would get possibly another $500 in the case where we had a qualifying child, which would typically be under the age of 17. However, if over the age of 17 and being claimed as a dependent, then you would get no benefit either to the person that would be either to the individual or the person claiming the dependent. Now, students often have an extended point in time if they're full-time students where they can still be claimed as dependents on the tax return of the parent. But if the student is not being claimed as a dependent of the parent, in other words, they're self-supporting college students as indicated here, then they still may be under the threshold to file a return and may not have filed a return, but in that case could be qualified for an economic impact payment. And if a qualification for an economic impact payment is there, then you'd want to be notifying the IRS and make sure that you can do so in order to pick up the economic impact payment. Back to the text. In advance of the National EIP Economic Impact Payment Registration Day on November 10th, and highlighted in, quote, a closer look, end quote, there's a link to a closer look here, the IRS is reminding people who don't normally file a tax return they may be eligible to register for an economic impact payment with a quick visit to the non-filer tool. There's a link to that here on IRS.gov. In particular, the IRS wants to remind self-supporting students with little or no income that they may be eligible for payments of $1,200 or more. So again, these self-supporting students not being claimed as a dependent didn't file a tax return because they're not required to, possibly because their income is below the threshold. Therefore, IRS would not have the information with which to send out the economic impact payments. If you're in that situation, then you might want to use the non-filer tool here to provide the information to the IRS so they can send out the economic impact payment. Quote, the IRS is working hard with our partners across the country to raise awareness about the upcoming deadline to register for a payment, end quote, said IRS Commissioner Chuck Rettig. Quote, college students in particular should be careful not to overlook these payments if they're supporting themselves and can't be claimed as a dependent on someone's tax returns. A few minutes to research could really help students, end quote. While most eligible individuals automatically received, there's a link to automatically received, their economic impact payments, others who don't have a filing obligation can only get their money by registering online with the IRS. So the basic rule, the basic idea or concept that happened here, the economic payments tied to 2021 taxes actually, but they gave the economic payment based on prior year tax returns, that being 2019 if available. Oftentimes it was not because there was an extension on the filing deadline for 2019. Therefore, they would go back to 2018. If you hadn't filed 2019 or 2018, then they would like you to file the return if you're required to do so. If not, you may not have gotten the economic impact payment unless they had some other format to know, the requirements to send out the payment, which could include people that get Social Security benefits or other some kind of government benefit where the IRS knows the individuals, knows the Social Security number, and knows where to send the check. They may still have sent out the payment. However, if you don't fall into any of those categories, then you may not have gotten the payment because we haven't filed the tax return. IRS has no other way of knowing where to send the payment or anything like that. And that is what they're looking to push out at this point, for those people to give them the information so that they can then give out the economic impact payment. Students could fall into that situation because oftentimes if you're a college student, you may still be claimed as a dependent on your parents' return. If that's the case, then this may not apply to you. However, if you're not being claimed on the parents' return, then it may then apply in that situation. And that would be another situation where you may not have filed. The IRS doesn't have the information. They wouldn't have sent out the money. And so you'd need to provide them the information in order to do so. If you don't meet this deadline, then you might have to want to file the tax return for 2020 in 2021. And then you should hopefully be able to pick up the payment at that point. So the only way to do that is to use the non-filer tools available exclusively on IRS.gov. Those eligible to use the tool can include people who receive little or no income, including many self-supporting students. The IRS emphasizes that only self-supporting students who are not required to file a return should use the non-filers tool. So we're talking self-supporting students. That means you're not being claimed as a dependent on some other return, and you're not required to file a tax return, meaning your income threshold is not over a certain limit with which, or in which case, you would have to file a tax return. If you just didn't file the tax return, in other words, and you're supposed to, then the IRS would like you to file the tax return. Dependent students do not qualify. This means that any student who is claimed as a dependent on their parent or someone else cannot get a payment. Now, I would imagine this could end up in situations or result in situations where you have students that were, dependents in the prior year, and then they're miraculously not dependents in the year in which they could qualify for an economic impact payment. But in any case, that's the situation. So students who either need to or want to file a regular return should not use the non-filer tool. This includes, for example, any student who had federal income tax withheld from their pay and wants to file a return to claim a refund. So in other words, if you're under the threshold in which you have to file a return, then you don't need to file a return, but you may still want to file a return. And if you're going to file a return, the IRS wants you to file the return and not use the tool. The tool is in place of doing a return. Why would you want to file a return if you're not required to? One, if you had any withholdings, then you're going to get the money back, so you'd want to file the return in order to get the refund. And two, you might have you might have credits that could be refundable credits, including a child tax credit possibly, or earned income credits, which actually could pay back money even if under the threshold. So the IRS reminds students who have summer jobs or part-time positions not to overlook filing a return so they can receive a potential federal tax refund. And again, you might think, well, federal tax refund, I only withheld like $25 on my paycheck. But again, if you qualify for like a refundable tax credit, you might get more than that $25 because you might get, and that includes a child tax credit possibly if that's something that qualifies, or an earned income tax credit, which could be some factors that could increase the amount of refund over the amount that was actually withheld, which means it's not really a refund in that case. It's more like a kind of program, but that's the situation. Since the non-filer tool launched in spring, over 8 million people have used it to register for a payment, but time is running out, and the IRS urges any eligible student to register soon ahead of the November 21st registration deadline. Anyone who misses the November 21st cutoff will need to wait until next year and instead claim a recovery rebate credit when they file their 2020 federal income tax return. So if you don't file the tool, like if the IRS doesn't have your information and you don't use the tool, which is there up until November 21st, then you'll have to actually file the tax return for 2020, which of course wouldn't be filed until 2021. So remember, this credit is actually tied to the 2020 tax return that's going to be filed in 2021, but they're trying to push it out, early to as many people as possible. But if you don't get that, then you got to file the tax return. And if you're someone that doesn't normally file a tax return, then it's going to be more burdensome to file a tax return than simply use the non-filer tool. So some recent college graduates from 2019 and 2020 may not have received an economic impact payment because they were claimed as a dependent by their parents or someone else. The IRS reminds these graduates that they may be eligible for an economic impact payment when they file their 2020 tax return in early 2021. So it may be the case, that in prior years you were filed as a dependent, possibly for graduates in 2019, or you were a dependent in 2019 and a student, and then miraculously in 2020 you are no longer dependent and may then qualify for a economic impact payment. And that could be because you graduated, of course, that you would no longer be claimed as a dependent. So, but bottom line, if you're claimed as a dependent, then you can't get the $1,200 credit. And if you're not claimed as a dependent, self-supporting, then you may qualify for the credit, which, I mean, I would think that could affect some people's tax planning strategy. But in any case, anyone using the non-filer tool can speed up the arrival of the payment by choosing to receive it by direct deposit. Those not choosing this option will get a check. The non-filer's tool is designed for people with incomes typically below $24,400 for married couples and $12,200 for singles who could not be claimed as a dependent by someone else. This includes couples and individuals who are experiencing homelessness and students. Beginning 2 weeks after they register, people who can track the status of their payment using the Get My Payment tool, so you can track the payment using that tool. There's a link to that here. It's also available on the IRS website at IRS.gov, IRS.gov. Normally, a self-supporting student who registers will receive a $1,200 payment if they are single, or $2,400 if married and file a joint return. If they have dependent children, they will normally also get an additional $500 for each qualifying child. Visit IRS.gov and, quote, a closer look, end quote, to find out more. There's a link to a closer look here. There'll be a link to this in the description.